section 1.4, developments in the Americas in the post-classical period. Again, talking 1200 to 1450 CE. Okay, so we're going all over. We're going to start in North America, and we're going to start in North America with the Mississippian culture. So we've talked about the Mississippian culture in class before, but we didn't call it the Mississippian culture. It's kind of a new name. They are, so obviously they're along the Mississippi River Valley. And they are known for kind of the trade network that they created, but then also the earthen mounds that were kind of the center of the trade network, possibly, especially at the mound of Cahokia, right? Which we've seen before, which you can see here. Right here is the kind of earthen mound. They're not entirely sure what it was for. It could be burial site, could be like a trade center, could be housing. But they did kind of show that they had some sort of organization because they were able to build these large mounds, right? Okay. We have for their government and society, right? We have a pretty rigid social structure, not a whole lot of movement here. And at the very top, we have the great sun, the ruler, right? And then below them, we have priests and nobles. All right. So a pretty typical setup here, followed by the farmers. Right. So nothing too unique about this setup, followed by slaves, usually prisoners of war, right, captured during battle. Right. We tend to see women being the farmers, whereas the men tend to hunt. But they're kind of still part of the same, little social class. One of the other interesting things about the Mississippi culture is that they had a matrilineal society, which means that property and social standing is determined by, so let's just say lineage on the mother's side rather than the father's side, which is how it typically was at this time, right? Okay. They kind of decline around 1450, and by 1600 they're completely gone, right? So one of the theories for collapse is that flooding or crop failures kind of led to them moving away from these societies. That's one of the major theories. But then, of course, you have the diseases from the Europeans as well being a likely cause for their demise. Okay. Our other two cultures we want to talk about here in North America are Chaco and Mesa Verde, which everybody's seen Better Call Saul, the bank that his girlfriend works for is Mesa Verde Bank, which is interesting. So these are in the Southwest United States, so like modern day New Mexico, Arizona. Right. So because of that very dry climate, they had to learn how to kind of deal with that climate, those issues, specifically water storage kind of became the major theme of the period. Right. And on top of that, they could not necessarily build homes with trees. And so they each kind of came up with their own little innovations here. The Chaco used stone and clay to build their houses, right? Whereas the Mesa Verde built their houses into the side of cliffs, the cliffside homes, cliffside houses using sandstone, right? So kind of some innovation here in a climate that's not particularly kind to humans living there. However, as the climate continued to get drier in that region, we see them fade away. And we can see here is the Chaco building complex, right? So you can see kind of the stone that's made out of. And then here you have the Mesa Verde built into this cliffside, right? So they carved out the cliff to create these houses, which is super cool. Right? All right. So now we're going to move into the Central American area, starting with the kind of, not the progenitor, that'd be the Olmec, but the probably most culturally background the cultural touchstone for a lot of American society, and that is the Maya civilization. Right. So they were in Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, so Central America. There is a huge society, and that first off is focused around the political organization of city-states, right? Each city-state has a king, and they rule kind of the area around it. Sometimes there's queens, right? Depending on if there was a male heir or not. We have war between the city-states, but not for territory, but for human sacrifices, right? That kind of was the key reason for their battles, right? Was so that they could sacrifice humans during religious ceremonies, right? The kings themselves are considered to be descended from God or gods, right? And that when he died or she died, they'd become an ancestor god, right? And so to kind of help run the governments, we have not just scribes, right? People to write stuff down, which the Mayans did have a written language. Scribes and priests kind of govern the city-states, right? We sometimes we also had taxes, crop taxes for the common folk, in the military service when there was war for the farmers, right? Okay. So probably the most important thing about the Maya is their religion. Their religion, which is the backbone for most of Central American religion, science, and technology, right? They created a concept of zero, right, pretty early on, before most other people had. They had a complex writing system that I don't believe has been deciphered. I could be wrong on that, though. And then they even learned how to make rubber, long before anybody else did. Their religion is linked to astronomy, right, as a technology, right? They will expand their astronomical knowledge due to their religion, especially because of the use of the ritual calendar, right? And then they would use their temples for astronomical observations, especially the most famous temple of Chichen Itza. Right, and which you can see right here, right? So they would go up here and look at the skies and make observations of the skies based on or by going up there. And yeah, they human sacrifice. We already talked about that, so I'm not going to go into too much on that. So yeah, that's the Maya very briefly. Okay, the kind of powerhouse though of Central America is without a doubt the Aztecs, which also have another name, the Mexica. Right, so the Mexica is the name of the people, but the Aztecs is the name of the empire. Right, their capital city is the city of Tenochtitlan, which of course is modern day where Mexico City is, located on Lake Texcoco. They built it there for defenses, right, on the lake, right, and then they would conquer their neighbors. Remember, they had an alliance with two cities to kind of create the Aztec alliance. The Mexica were just the most powerful of that alliance, right? Okay, so to get water to the city in the middle of a lake, they created a series of aqueducts, which again very similar to the Roman aqueducts, which brought water from kind of higher up areas. They also had a Great Pyramid, but the thing I really want to focus on is the use of chinampas, right, which are floating farms, right? They would drudge up the bottom of the lake. They would get that very fertile soil, and then they bring it to the top and kind of put it on these floating islands, and farm on these floating islands, which is amazing, super cool. Okay. Their government structure, so they were an empire, but they were built around a tribute system. they were built around a tribute system, and that tribute system had local rulers in charge. Right, so they basically let the local rulers do whatever they wanted as long as they paid tributes, whether that be, money, or land, or soldiers, or even sacrifices. Right, those would kind of be the tribute that they would want. Right, they talked about some of the luxury goods, this out of this money. Right, I should say not money, but luxury goods. Right, they talked about some of those. Feathers, beds, beads, jewelry, food, also, right? Yeah. Let's go here. So it was kind of provincial, right? They had these different tribute areas almost, but their government style was also a theocracy, right? So it's a little bit decentralized, but also it is a theocracy, right, where religious leaders rule, especially led by a man known as the Great Speaker, who a lot of times was from the priest class, right, and also represents the gods as well. Okay, we have the next up in the kind of social structure is the landowning nobles, right, who got a lot of wealth off of their land, especially because the government would basically force peasants to work their land. We got scribes and healers, and then we have merchants. Sorry, not merchants. Craftspeople. Yes, craftspeople, and a particular. I don't know why. Why are we saying craftspeople? Why is it doing this? Artisans. These are artisans, and then a particular group of merchants known as the Pochteka, who were merchants for the government, specifically. Right, the government controlled most trade. Right. Below that, we have peasants and soldiers. I'm going to go over here. Peasants and soldiers next. And then at the very bottom, there are slaves. Not just prisoners of war, but also debtor slaves. Right? If they went into too much debt, your family could sell you into slavery, and then also criminals would become slaves as well. Right? Religiously speaking, they are polytheistic, right? So they're a polytheistic religion, right? They practiced a lot. They worshipped hundreds of different gods, and it really changed depending on what's going on. And that, of course, had to do with human sacrifice, right? They believed that the gods would sacrifice themselves to make the world go, so they had to sacrifice humans, even especially to kind of fertilize the soil, right? They thought that blood would make the soil work better, right? A huge amount of sacrifice, although we don't actually know how much, because the book kind of argues that, hey, we heard this from the Spanish, so maybe they're trying to make them sound worse than they were, right? Women play an important economic role as weavers, right? They are making cloth that goes into the tribute system, right, which makes them kind of very economically very important for the society. Which would also lead to kind of polygamy, as men would want more wives to have more cloth to pay more tribute, right? We do have some as scribes, right, as kind of working for the royal family, right? We do have some work outside of the home. So the thing I actually want to add that this book did not talk about, that we talked about in our book, is that they were esteemed as the mother of warriors, right? This is a very militaristic society, and so they really worshipped women as the mother of warriors. So they were held in a high regard, almost similar to Sparta in that way, right? And so let's finally talk about the kind of decline of the Aztecs. So a couple things here. They have a low tech level, right? Their technology is not very good, especially like when it comes to transportation. No wheels, no pack animals, which means farming and trade is pretty tough. And then their militaristic society leads to a lot of anger amongst their tributes, right? Leads to the distrust of the tributes. And so that causes a lot of tension, right? And then when the Spanish invade, which we'll talk about fairly soon. When the Spanish invade, that leads to the tributes rising up against the Aztecs and helping the Spanish, right? And so that will kind of be the end of them in the 16th century. Okay. Finally, our last society here in the Americas during this time period is the Inca. Let me do a little thing here. Yeah. Okay. So the Inca are founded by the man Pachacuti, Earthshaker. Right. He is the founder. He expands a kind of small area around Cuzco into this massive empire all the way from Ecuador to Chile. Right. Creates the Incan Empire. His son, Huayna Capac, will rule the empire and kind of make sure that this empire is good. Right. So it's very large, and so because of this, they also have a provincial style government, right? Which means that they have provinces. Each of those provinces have their own governors, right? Very similar to the Aztecs. An interesting here is no tribute, no taxes, and that sort, and instead had to work for the governments. Each male, was it 15 to 50, had to work for the government for a certain amount of time each year. Known as the Mita system, right? The system of labor, which will come into play later when the Spanish show up. And specifically what they're working on there is kind of like farming and road building, right? Kind of infrastructure stuff as well. Okay. So religiously speaking, Inca means the people of the sun. And so that means that the Inti, the sun god, is the most important of their gods. They do have many, but Inti is definitely the one. And in fact, rulers are considered representatives of Inti on Earth, right? So they are also kind of theocratic in a way, right? So two key things here about Incan religion is honoring the sun, and then the worship of the royal ancestors, right? So like basically worshiping the dead kings as gods, right? Right. And this all centered around one particular building in Cuzco, the Temple of the Sun, right? Which, if you're not figuring it out by now, I should have mentioned more explicitly. Cuzco is the capital of the Incan Empire, right? So you would also see some pretty interesting stuff along here. You would see mummification, very similar to India. And then on top of this, you would see that like the land that the emperor conquered was considered his land, and so the next emperor, right, would have to expand to kind of find his own tomb in a way. Had to expand in order to be able to kind of find a place for him to be buried. And stuff like that, right? Now, technically, the Incan Empire expanded, right? It's all the Incan Empire, but that particular emperor would have to find his own land and stuff like that, which is interesting, right? Right. Priests are very important, obviously. Priests are consulted by the rulers. You got to make sure you don't upset the sun god. They would. They had a lot of kind of what's I'm looking for? Foretelling the future, kind of like scrying abilities, I guess, like seeing into the future. I guess is what we would say there, right? And then, of course, we do have some human sacrifice in this religion, although not nearly as much as the Aztecs, at least according to what we know about both of them, right? Another aspect of their religion is animism, right? The idea that nature had supernatural powers, right? We've talked about that before, okay? Key achievements include the Quipu system. Did we look at I'm sorry, I don't think we looked at the Temple of the Sun. Here it is, on top of the mountains in Cuzco, right? Which is pretty cool. Quipu are the, I don't want that. I want that. knotted strings, right, that were used to keep track of records and stuff like that. Okay. In agriculture, they created a system of farming called the Waru Waru, which is kind of this terraced farming system that can help create better irrigation, which is well needed in the highlands of Peru. Right. A massive roadway system. They built. So the Incan Empire is very narrow, right? Very big and very narrow, which means that they need a good road system to get around on it. And that road system is called the Carpanon. Right. 25,000 miles of road. That's quite a bit. Okay. And then we see a civil war happen at the time of Pizarro's arrival. Right. So that causes the kind of breakdown and decline of the Incan Empire. But of course, we also don't forget about disease as well, naturally, for the Inca. And that kind of leads to their collapse about a half century after the Aztecs. Right. The question becomes, how similar are these cultures in the Americas? Nobody really knows. There are some arguments for and against. They have a lot of similarities in between, especially the South American and Central American ones, but nobody really knows. There's a table there on page 39 that could be quite useful to kind of look at about some of the similarities and differences. Maybe there will be a question about all that. But that's going to do it for today, or for this section.